Thank you, Guy. The financial sector is a big consumer of digital identity. Financial institutions need to know who is on the other side of the keyboard, and have a strict international regulations. For our closing second session, please welcome Mr. Avi Cohen, CEO and co-founder of The Floor, and Mr. Yair Finzi, CEO and co-founder of SecuredTouch, for their presentation on authentication and fintech, trends and insights. Wait for just 1 minute. We're replacing a cable here, so the presentation won't. Okay? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Avi. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of The Floor. For those of you who are less familiar with The Floor, we are a global fintech innovation center based in Tel Aviv and just recently also in Hong Kong. And we're working with 6 international banks to shape the bank of the future, which means that we're building together with them the strategies and the implementations of certain technologies that will impact the bank, the bank's customers, and different branches of the bank's business. And in order to do that, we also need to protect the bank, because as much as you become more open and innovative, there are new cyber threats around it. So actually yesterday at the conference, we announced that we launched The Floor Cyber, which is our new cyber arm, which is led by General Doron Tamir, which I think some of the people in the audience are familiar with the name. He's the part of the founding teams of Israel National Cyber Bureau. And this team is tasked with tackling the most complex challenges around innovation from the cyber angle for some of our banks. And I'm going to talk today about some of the trends and insight that we're seeing in working with banks and how that correlates with the fintech industry and what we're doing internally at The Floor. So I think you heard a lot about authentication today. I'm going to try and phrase and frame the entire presentation around the banking industry alone. I know there are other applications for some of the technologies that you'll be seeing here, but since we work with banks, the use cases are very clear. And I'm also focusing today on what the banks are seeing as the majority of the transition into behavior and biometrics methods in order to authenticate customers in different avenues of the bank. Of course, behavior is also being used for authentication, but actually with some of the companies that we work today on the behavior side, there are also business opportunities. So it's also interesting to see the shift into behavior analytics being used also to not just authenticate the customer, but also to learn about the behavior of the customer and how that may lead to new lead generation from the banking side. And of course, there's also the biological features, which are more complex and much more difficult to fake. We all know the numbers. The financial industry is by far the most attacked industry, and there's a good reason why it happens. But of course, banks are very much more protected than other institutions, but we're still seeing a large growing number of attacks on financial institutions. And when you go back to the linking or the most weakest point, usually becomes the employees or the customers of the banks, which is why banks are struggling and trying to find better ways and more accurate ways to protect the customers and protect the bank's employees as well. And actually the quote here is taken from our recent cyber report, which Yair, the CEO and co-founder of SecuredTouch, participated in, and is coming up after me to present the company. So basically, banks see authentication not just from a cyber risk, but also from a business point of view. So there's a research that showed that 44% of customers would switch bank. And I don't know if you know, but usually in banks, people, if by the age of 28 they haven't changed the bank, they'll never change the bank afterwards. So, which means that that's a big problem for a bank. If there's an authentication or a breach and a customer leaves, that's even a bigger problem also from a business point of view. So we went through the evolution of authentication. We all know from the 1960s, MIT's using the password, which we sadly stayed with us for such a long time. We moved into the 2000s years, which basically went to password and verification, OTPs, and other ways of authentication. And of course, we're moving into the next era. Hopefully, we'll get rid of passwords and OTPs. I have one of our financial institutions that told us once that they were the first bank in their country to implement OTP, and they managed to reach an agreement with the government that they have exclusivity over OTP for 2 years. That was like a big achievement back then. Of course, OTPs today looks very silly, and we're moving on to new methods, which is today basically around what we know, what we have, and who we are. But when you look at the different methods of authentications, specifically from a bank's perspective, it correlates with what customers know about authentication and what is most immediate from their perspective. And of course, fingerprints, and that's also being led predominantly by what banks and customers know of. So mobile manufacturers, I think, are setting the tones for a lot of these new methods of authentication. So fingerprints have been introduced by the iPhone and by Samsung and other mobile manufacturers, and then the banks and some other financial institutions had to kind of adapt to that new era. And that's why a lot of these methods are more familiar to the customers, while actually some of the more advanced ones, all the way up to behavioral biometrics, are less familiar, but actually sometimes are better in terms of less friction and a better customer experience. So if we go by step and how we phase to the biometrics, so we had the fingerprints in the beginning, we moved on to new ways like the iris scan, the face recognition, and so forth, all the way up to what we'll see in the future, which is a combination of everything in living in a connected world. We're always connected, smart cities, smart cars, smart homes, where the information gathered from all of those environments will also be fueling the authentication process, also from a financial institution's point of view. And of course, regulation is a major catalyst and a driver in order to encourage banks or push banks or force banks in order to innovate and find better ways. PSD2, as we all know, is a big catalyst around that, and that will impact the way that banks also interact from an authentication point of view, but also from opening their APIs and giving access to third parties to provide other financial services built upon their own infrastructure. And I think that kind of leads me to show how some of the financial institutions that we work with and others are coping today with these challenges around the authentication. And I think we have a couple of interesting examples here. I'll start with Santander, one of our banks that implemented last year a solution by Nuance, which is basically in-app capability in order to authenticate the customer through voice authentication, but also conducts different type of transaction through the app, which is built in a chat with Santander's banking application. We also have an example from HSBC, which is using FaceBuy, which is a Spanish company, and basically using face recognition built upon the unique features of the face of the customer in order to authenticate and basically also reduce the fraud rate around that. We have example also from Wells Fargo that was launched 2 years ago, in which also customers are using the face recognition for the iVein methods in order to authenticate themselves, and that's also a good example of a more advanced feature. And also in the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, are using heartbeat as a biometric feature to identify. Again, there are challenges around it. There's also advantages to it. As you can imagine, people's heartbeat remains not static throughout their life, but there's also other features around it. Of course, if you go through a heart attack or some kind of a heart condition, that might impact your situation as well. And of course, I don't know if you can see that. Okay, but NatWest is working also. NatWest is a subsidiary bank of RBS in the UK, also working with BioCatch, another Israeli company, on behavioral analytics. And of course, if we also think about kind of the need to go into more innovative ways and how banks will adapt in that case, I think that one of the things that we've seen from the floor is also not to rely on just what we're seeing in Western market, but we also wanted to advance into some of the innovation that we're seeing coming out from Asia, and particularly also looking at the different trends in China and Hong Kong and Singapore, which I think that if you've been part of the fintech revolution or fintech trends in the recent years, there's definitely a trend, massive trends happening in Asia that are by far more advanced than what we're seeing in Western markets. And I think that for us, it's also a way to connect those type of trends and technologies to our Western partners, to our Western banks, So I wanted to show you a few examples from Asia. I don't know if you can zoom out a little bit so everyone can see the names of some of those examples. No? Okay. So this is an example from China in which they've taken upon the example of fingerprint authentication on mobile phones and integrated into a credit card. So the credit card has built-in embedded fingerprint solution, and it's a contactless payment method. So you go around, you can pay, and some might ask why in China people would need to use a physical credit card to authenticate. This is why everything today is being done through WeChat in China, but actually in this example, some customers prefer to have an alternative way of paying with a physical credit card alongside their WeChat or their Alipay payment method. We also have an example from Taiwan, from a bank called CTBC, in which they implemented last year vein patterns authentication method. What's interesting about this example is we have another example from a Western bank that tried the same method, and I think that's also a good kind of angle to look at authentication methods. In the Western example of this, they implemented this technology, but after a few weeks, the customers of the bank complained that it's not a sanitized method to authenticate themselves. And people actually complained that they don't want to put their finger where other fingers were before them. In Asia, no one complained in Taiwan. Everyone liked that method. So I think what we're seeing is also not all methods of authentication can work in each geography. It kind of depends also on the geographies that you're based at. And again, Alibaba through their Ant Financial Fintech arm implemented in KFC an interesting way to pay with Pay by Smile, which is done in the KFC branches in some areas in China. SMBC, one of our banks in Japan, is also using a ways of fingerprint authentication and voice or face in order to onboard customers onto their app. And there's a nice example also for WeChat, how they link their identity cards of some people around areas in China in order to authenticate customers by facial recognition. So what's next? So we're seeing some interesting trends in different ways of innovative authentication, in which we see how they might be implemented in the future, or even now, actually. We have some examples also by mobile picture analysis, where your photo gallery inside your phone could be used in a way to authenticate yourself through a third party. We're seeing also that through ultrasonic sound, your emotional, so cognitive ID, how you can authenticate yourself also by cognitive behavior, of course biological parameters, and in motion as well. I think to summarize, the best way, I think, or the right way, I don't think there's a wrong way in this. I think the right way from a bank's perspective is find the sweet spot between customer experience and security. So how you balance customer experience with the security, how you prevent more friction, and how you find the right way that fits your geography, your customer base, and also the way that you interact with your customers. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I'll wait for my slides. In the meantime, a few words on myself and on SecuredTouch. Here we go. So we'll try to break down a little bit that buzzword that I guess some of you heard already on behavioral biometrics. Before that, again, a few words on myself. So my name is Yair Finzi. I used to study actually in this university in the electronics engineering campus here. Later on, during the Army service, I finished it as a head of cybersecurity department. And after that, about 3 years ago, I co-founded SecuredTouch, which is a company in the behavioral biometric space focusing on mobile-first solutions. SecuredTouch, over these 3 years, to date, raised $12 million and deployed on millions of users, especially in banks applications, financial sector, as well as e-commerce sector. And before we start, Avi, thank you for the help with security versus user experience. I would like to ask you a question. We all use fingerprint, and many banks already deployed fingerprints in order and other biometrics methods in order to log in their users. And I want to ask you whether fingerprint is considered as a security feature or user experience feature. Maybe you can help me. Please raise your hand. Who think it's a security feature? Fingerprint, okay. Who's thinking that it's a user experience feature? Okay, anyone thinks it's both? Okay, so in fact, in most of the cases, the answer is it's pure user experience feature. The reason is that in most of deployments, banks that are allowing fingerprint access are still allowing to use a fallback to the password, right? So if my finger is wet or something, I can log in still with my password. So in fact, they just open another door in terms of in a security perspective. But still, it's about allowing the users to access more easily to the bank. And it's very interesting. Why is that? Because 98% of the users are just good users. So just you and I, or most of us, I think we have like 100 people here, so probably 2 of us are bad users. I don't know who you are, but you are here. And, but most of us are good users, and that's why we see that there are so much wide deployments of user experience features just as the fingerprints. Now, behavioral biometrics somehow takes this to the next level, and it's kind of the next generation of this solution to that balance of security and user experience. In fact, with behavioral biometrics, you can have both, thanks to the fact that it is behind the scenes. It is behind the scenes as so for those who are not familiar with the concept. As we focus on mobile, I'll give some examples for mobile. So it's a transparent layer that is there behind the scenes, analyzing the sensors of the device while somebody is using that application of a bank or e-commerce or whatever, and have identity insights on that user that's using that app while he's browsing this application and while he's touching the phone, holding it and so on. To give some examples, so many of us logging in with a fingerprint, and then we want to do some transactions. So in the generation of multi-factor authentication, many times when we want to do the actual transaction, which is money transfer, watch our balance, and whatever it is, we are many times being asked to have another factor for the multi-factor, for the second factor. So when you have behavioral biometrics, you can actually have that factor behind the scenes transparently and just do the transaction seamlessly without any friction. How does that work? Let's see if okay. So to give you a bit more technical description of how it works, so when you browse in this application, in addition to the application data that is running anyway today between the application and the server of that bank, the behavioral data is being sent to analysis in the server. Algorithms analyze the behavior, the physical interaction of that individual with the device, and actually generates many insights, including a scoring of the profile of that user for what we call invisible authentication. These are the authentication use cases, but also to tell whether there is any suspicious fraud over there, whether this is a real device or virtual device, whether this is a real human being or versus a bot. So all of that is being done continuously and behind the scenes, as you can see here. So these are two main things very important to understand about behavioral biometrics. Again, one, it is seamless. So the user does not have to be aware. Both the enrollment and the validation are being done invisibly. And it is continuous as well. So it's not only on the login, it's during the whole life cycle of the session. Some of the, so one of the speakers before talked about level of assurance. So it's interesting because it's all about risk perception, right? So level of assurance is definitely connected to that because it's not yes, no question whether this is you or not. It's more, how close you are to what we learned about you before. So it could be definitely used in order to determine the level of assurance, but also for more popular use cases like, as I said, invisible authentication, fraud detection, adding more functionality to the digital channel thanks to the fact that you have high security without asking the users to do anything, and so on. In the end of the day, customers, which are mainly large enterprises, have full visibility for, on the one end, for each individual, so they can see, the score for that user going on and changing continuously through the session. If you will, it's their eyes that they don't have today behind these sessions, these digital sessions, but also can have a full picture of all users, the distribution, whether there is any suspicious event in the system in terms of automated tools that are taking it, account takeover, and so on and so forth. So that were 6 minutes on behavioral biometrics. Would happy to address any questions. Okay. Yes, please. So again, are you measuring from a security perspective or user experience perspective? That's the first question. Okay, from security perspective. So and if you're talking on a bank, for example, the answer is that honestly you cannot rely only on the consideration of security, because you can have something very, very secured, but the user will will leave you if they cannot access their accounts. So you have to look at that as a comprehensive solution, and unfortunately, I don't think any bank will choose only one type of factor. It's always a combination of this one. It's more holistic point of view on that. If you, in the end of the day, if you come to me and ask me, I want to choose one of them, I will tell you, you have an issue with your bank or with your e-commerce. Okay, thank you.